been with us the last several weeks, you know that we are in week 6 of what we're calling Game of Thrones. We are just reading through the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we do that really simply. One chapter a day, so after 7 days you come together and we talk about something from those 7 chapters that we've read. I'm always amazed at people who are persistent, and I love persistence. So I want to just applaud a few of you for a minute. How many of you have been reading and are still up to date with us in 1st and 2nd Samuel? All right, we've got several. Good job. Give those guys a round of applause. And if you are reading with us, you know that as we walk through 1st and 2nd Samuel, there's so much in here. There's no way we can cover all of it in 20 or 30 minutes, the 7 chapters that we've read this week. There's so much that we could talk about this morning. We could talk about David and Michelle. I think that's how you say his wife's name. When she was really bitter after he came back into Jerusalem with the ark. We could talk about David and Mephibosheth, just because Mephibosheth is a fun name to say. We could talk about a number of things, but really what we're going to end up looking at is probably the one story that you know. Whether or not you've been in church, whether or not you've been reading with us, you probably know this one story. It's probably the most famous story in all of 2 Samuel that we're going to look at this morning for a few minutes. But before we do that, let me ask you guys a question. How many of you have ever been to or participated in a game where you had to escape, like an escape room kind of game? Anybody done that before? All right, so there are a few of those around Fort Collins. They're becoming more popular. It's one of those deals where you go and it may be a team building exercise or whatever, but you take a group, you go to this place, they give you a scenario. So you may be in a dungeon, you may be in a prison, you may be on a space station, whatever the scenario is. And then they give you clues, and you have to start figuring out from the first clue how to get to the second clue, how to get to the third clue, and eventually how to get out of the scenario that you were in. I've never done that, but I love those types of games. I feel like those are the things that just kind of come natural to me. A lot of times I say that, and I would probably be the last one out of the room, but I would enjoy every minute of it, right? But I love those kind of games because, like I said, it just feels like they come natural in so many ways. Our family did something similar not long ago. We went down to Denver, and being fairly new to Colorado, we wanted to just see some of the major sites in Denver, and we found this game that you can do on your phone. You may be aware of this, but there's a scavenger hunt that you can do. It's kind of like the Amazing Race. So you start off going to a location. It tells you on the phone, hey, here's what you need to figure out. And when you figure out that clue, it takes you to the next location, the major thing. And then you go to another. And so we spent like 3 hours just touring Denver, seeing all the major stuff in Denver. Through this scavenger hunt that we did. And you know what? Like I said, I feel like I'm pretty good at those kind of things. Our family wasn't first on the fastest, but we weren't running. We weren't trying to be first, but we weren't anywhere near the bottom either. So we did pretty good. So in those type of games, I tend to do pretty well. But if you put like a crossword puzzle in front of me, and I'm supposed to be a word guy. I majored in English in college, but you put a crossword puzzle in front of me and tell me my life depends on this, and I will say, just shoot me now, because I have no idea how this works. I don't get the little clues that they give you. I don't know why, certain boxes fit the way that they do. I always figure out a word that'll fit, and that messes everything else up, right? And so I can't get that to save my life. I think, if we're honest, all of us have those type things where some things we feel like, man, this is right up my alley. This is right where I hit my sweet spot. This is where I am smart. I am good at this stuff. And then we have those other things that, if we're honest, we look at them and we kind of say, yeah, this is where I'm like as sharp as a bowl of Jell-O. I just don't get it. I'm dumb as a stick when it comes to this kind of stuff over here. All of us have those things in life. If we're truthful, I think every one of us would say, yeah, I'm pretty smart at some things. Maybe not everything, but I'm smart at some things. I haven't met many people yet that have come up to me and said, John, I'm just as dumb as they come. I just can't figure out life. Most people don't say that because that's not the way we feel most of the time. We feel like, I know some stuff, Maybe I don't know everything but I know some stuff. And you see that in school. right? You see where there's some kids that they go to school and from first grade through finishing their master's degree, they spend like 30 minutes total studying, and they just get it. They just get the test, they just listen to class and absorb it. And then there's some people that they may be the most culturally smart people that you know. They may have more people smarts than anybody else, but they'll tell you, you know what? I fought tooth and nail just to make it out of like 6th grade, and it took everything I had just to learn how to read, but they know people better than anybody else. They have some things they're really smart with, some things that maybe not so much. That's how all of us are. The problem is when we get to the point where we say, I'm pretty smart with stuff, and so we let intelligence take over the throne of our heart. As we talk about this idea of Game of Thrones, what we're talking about is there are all of these different thrones in our lives, that we let different kings sit on the throne at different times, and depending on what that king is, it causes us to make certain decisions, causes us to react certain ways to things. So we said that there are times where love sits on the throne of our hearts and it drives us in certain ways. There are times that discipline sits on the throne of our hearts, and because of that we do certain things. There are times where selfishness sits on the throne of our hearts. And really the big question we're asking is, how can we get out of this Game of Thrones? How can we come to the point where it is God that's sitting on the throne, and it's not just these emotions or intellect or anything else that's driving us at any given moment? And so we're kind of just taking it as Samuel brings it to us. But today what we're going to see is a story that's probably the most famous story ever told in relation to letting intelligence or rationalization sit on the throne of your heart. And if you say, I'm not sure I understand what you're talking about, let me just give you a quick example, because you've done this. I can almost promise you've done this. If you've ever said, I know I shouldn't do this, but this time it won't be a big deal. Nobody's ever going to know. It's not a big deal. It's not going to hurt anybody. If you have ever said that somewhere in your heart or in your mind, you have allowed intelligence to sit on the throne, to sit in the driver's seat of your life. If you've ever said, I know I shouldn't hide this from this person, from my spouse, from whoever it is, but I don't want to cause a problem, and so maybe it'll just go away, and so maybe I can just skirt around this, and I'll just keep my mouth shut. I know I shouldn't, but if you've ever thought that, you've allowed intelligence and rationalization to sit on the throne of your life. And when you do that, I don't have to tell you this, but when you do that, you end up in a mess. So I want you to see this story from 2 Samuel chapter 11. And like I said, it's the most famous story of rationalization ever told. You'll recognize this, but maybe we're going to look at this story from a little different angle today than you've seen it before. So let's just jump in. 2 Samuel chapter 11, starting in verse 1. It says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Just a couple of quick things here. First of all, it says that in the spring, it was the time that kings went off to war. And you may look at that and say, what does that mean? That's so weird, because in the United States, we don't have like a war season, right? We don't have a season where we say, okay, spring is when we go attack people. We just, if we have to go to war, we go to war. We don't want to do it. But in this culture, in this time, the way that it worked was nations were always kind of fighting with each other. And if you lived next door to somebody, you always wanted a little more control. And so they did this every year in the springtime. They would go out to war in the spring because winter was just not a good time to go to war. Basically, they would say in the winter, hey, we're calling a peace treaty. Everybody just go home. We'll act like we don't know each other for the next few months. And then we'll get together and have this party again where we fight each other, right? And so the reason it was in the spring is because in the winter it was rainy, the rainy season. You can imagine what that does to the landscape. Did they have roads like we have roads? Did they have paved roads? No. If you've ever spent any time on a dirt road after a ton of rain, you kind of know what it does. And just imagine if you were going out to war and you've got horses and chariots and thousands of guys that are traveling on these little roads, what that's going to do. They're going to get stuck in mud. They're going to get bogged down. They're going to have problems. And so they basically just said, okay, forget it. We're not going to war in the winter. We'll go in the spring when it gets nice and when we have crops that are coming in that can feed the troops and all of that kind of stuff. So every spring, that's what happened. All of the kings knew if you're a king, if you lived in this region, you're going to go to war when spring comes. That's the way it worked, and it happened this way for David. By the way, David had been a king for just a little while, and he had really been just picking off nations left and right. I mean, like a video game. You know, he was just taking them out one after the next. But at this point, he finally got to the point where he said, you know, I think I'm going to let my guys go do that while I just stay at home. I'm going to rest a few more months. So you see right at the end of the verse, it says that David remained in Jerusalem. I just want to point that out quickly because I want you to understand that when you have a battle in front of you that you decide, I'm just going to take it easy and maybe I'm going to disengage for a while. If you have a situation where you look at your family and you say, you know what, my family's in really good shape right now. I think I can just sit back and take it easy. If you look at your church and say, you know what, things are going well. I feel pretty spiritually healthy. I've actually read 1st and 2nd Samuel. You know, I'm doing pretty good. I can just sit back and take it easy for a little while. In those moments where we disengage, those are the moments that you're about to absolutely get run over. Those are the moments where you're about to be steamrolled. And David this is an intellect thing. He just makes a rational decision where he says, you know what, I think I'm going to enjoy just kind of getting fat for a little while. I think I'm going to enjoy just sitting at home for a little while these guys go out and fight the battles. And he's setting himself up for some pretty big heartache. Going on in verse 2, it says, one evening David got up from his bed and walked around the roof of the palace. From the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Again, I want to hit pause for just a second because there's so much going on here. This is almost comical. If it wasn't sad, it would be comical because it seems like an innocent thing that's happening here. David is, you know, he's been sleeping, he gets up, he's in the biggest house, he's in the palace, the king's palace, right? So he's looking down over all of the houses around him. And it's probably the middle of the night. I don't know what's going on, but he'd been asleep. He gets up and he's walking around and he sees this woman taking a bath. Let me ask you a question. Do you think there's any chance that David does not know who Bathsheba is? He probably knows who Bathsheba is, okay? Chances are pretty high. But he does an intelligence thing here. He puts intelligence on the driver's seat, and he says, if I just play dumb, nobody will ever suspect anything. If I just play like I don't know what's going on, nobody's ever going to worry about this, right? And so he looks down, and he's with somebody, and he says, who's that woman down there? And I love the guy's response, because he says, well, isn't that Bathsheba? Don't you know her dad, Eliam? Don't you know her husband, Uriah? And the ironic thing is Uriah is probably one of David's good friends. He's a leader in the army. He was one of David's 30 mighty men. He'd been fighting with David since before David was the king. And now he's in a place where he's a leader in the military, so he has a home next to the king. He's probably come over for plenty of celebrations. His family has probably come over for plenty of celebrations, even if they haven't. I mean, can you imagine not even visibly recognizing your neighbor? You know, that's ridiculous, right? And so David plays dumb. He says, who's that? Chances are he's been looking at Bathsheba for a while thinking, man, that wasn't my good friend's wife. She's kind of cute, you know. I think I could get myself into a mess. And at this point, he plays dumb in order to start getting what he wants. Going on in verse 4, it says, then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from uncleanness. Then she went back home. If you're at the point where you're rationalizing things in your life, where you're saying, I know I shouldn't, but this is where you want the story to end. Because this is the point where David is kind of thinking, hey, I got away with it, I'm smarter than everybody else. Who's going to tell on the king? Nobody's going to tell on the king. So I was able to get this done and everything's good, right? That's where you kind of want the story to end, when intelligence is sitting on the throne. But that's not where the story ends. You know that. Verse 5, it goes on and says, the woman conceived and sent word back to David saying, I am pregnant. What do you do with that? You just rationalized yourself into this situation that you knew you shouldn't be in the first place. And now you find out that, I can't just cover this up anymore. What do you do at that point? David has a huge choice that he can make right here. So look at what he decides to do. Verse 6. So David sent this word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent him to David. David comes up with a plan. Intelligence is sitting on the throne. He's saying, I'm going to figure this out. I'm smarter than everybody else. I can get this done. I may not be smart in everything in life, but I know how to get around the system here. And so he says to the military leader, he says, send Uriah back. Because I need to spend some time with Uriah. Verse 7, when Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. That's a kind of a funny Hebrew phrase. You can take it any way that you want to, and you'll probably be right, okay? Go down to your house, take it easy, wash your feet. You've been out, you've been away, you've been at war, spend time with your family, spend time with your wife. It says, so Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. All right, so plan one didn't work so well. She ended up getting pregnant. I thought we were going to be able to cover that up, right? Plan two now is not working so well. I brought this guy all the way back in from war, and I told him to go spend time with your family, and he decides to hang out at the steps with the servants. And he doesn't go home. And again, David has to start rationalizing, start figuring out what I do now. What do I do since he's not going home? So he has a conversation with Uriah. When David was told Uriah did not go home, he asked him, haven't you just come from a distance? Why didn't you go home? Uriah said to David, the ark in Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my master Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open fields. How can I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. He says, I'm a soldier, man. How can I just abandon everybody that I'm with and go enjoy my wife and enjoy my home? And he says, we're at war. I'm not going to do that. And so David's plan is thwarted again. Verse 12, then David said to him, okay, next plan. Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I'll send you back. So Uriah remained at Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. So they're celebrating, they're eating, they're feasting, and they have wine that they're passing around, and David just keeps filling up Uriah's glass. All right, last-ditch effort. This guy has to go home. He keeps filling up Uriah's glass until Uriah finally gets drunk. Still in verse 13, it says, but in the evening Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. It still doesn't work. One of the things that's just incredible to me about that last verse is you see what happens when intelligence is sitting on the ground. When our rationalization is overruling everything else, you see what happens. Because in this moment, the incredible thing of this story is that Uriah has more dignity and honor when he is drunk than David has when he is being led by rationalization. What an incredible picture that is. Uriah has more dignity when he is drunk than David has when he is rationalizing himself. says, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is the fiercest. Then withdraw from him so that he will be struck down and die. This is his friend. This is the guy who has risked his life for the sake of David over and over and over again. And David is writing a death sentence. And he hands it to the very guy that's going to be killed. We don't know how this played out. We don't know if he sealed it with the king's seal so that it couldn't be opened, or maybe Uriah was illiterate. And maybe that was another rationalization of David. Maybe he was saying, you know what? Bathsheba deserves somebody better. She deserves a smart man like me, not just a warmonger who can't even read this letter. And so he writes this letter, and he puts it in Uriah's hands, and he sends it to Joab at the battle line. Verse 16 says, so while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. We kind of, if you remember this story from way back, if you remember this story from Sunday school or when you were a kid, you kind of remember that Uriah dies. You kind of remember that he is the one who was killed by David. But did you see what it said right there? It said, some of the men in David's army fell, and Uriah was one of them. In other words, it wasn't just Uriah who died in this situation. The men of the army, the ones who were fighting for David, were the collateral damage. Here's the thing that I want you to see this morning, and this is the big idea that I think if you grab onto this, it can help start shape the way you think about this. Here's the thing. When our intellect overrules God, your entire team pays the price. When your intellect overrules God, your entire team pays the price. When David said, I think I've got a better plan, I think I can figure this out, when he started rationalizing all of that, it came to a point where it not only impacted him, not only did he suffer because of this, but his entire team suffered. Men who had nothing to do with this situation ended up being put in harm's way and being killed because David was letting intelligence sit over God and the throne of his heart. If you read the rest of the story, if you look at the rest of Scripture around this, what you end up seeing is that one of David's sons ends up rebelling against him because of this situation. He ends up trying to take the throne from his dad. He takes actually one of David's wives and sleeps with her publicly to make a statement of, I am more in charge than my dad is. That son ends up being killed as a result of this. And David's entire team paid the price for David's decision to rationalize all of this away. You may say, well, who's my team? What do you mean by that? You know, your team is your parents, your children, your spouse, your friends, anybody that you would call in the middle of the night and say, I need something, that's your team. And you know what we see here, and I think we all know deep down inside this is the truth, but what we see here is that when we decide to rationalize our way into sin, it doesn't just hurt us, it hurts our entire team. Everybody around us suffers as a result of us rationalizing our way into these things. Going on in verse 18, it says, Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, when you have finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up. He may ask you, why did you get so close to the city and fight? Joab is anticipating that David's going to be upset about Uriah's death. And it makes sense. I mean, you think about the way that David reacted when other people died. Do you remember when Saul died, right at the end of 1 Samuel, beginning of 2 Samuel? The guy comes to David and he says, hey, David, I've got some news for you. Saul is dead. You're going to be the king of Israel. And he probably thought David was going to be elated, like, I'm the king. You know, my enemy is taken care of. He's been wiped out. I'm the king. But that's not how David reacted, right? He grieved and he said, how do you know this? The guy ends up telling him, I was the one who actually ended up killing him. The whole story comes out. David says, you just sealed your fate, man. You just killed yourself. He says, you went against God's anointed one, and David grieves over this. A few chapters later, this guy named Abner, who was the leader of the army for Joab, against David. He gets killed. David grieves. He mourns. And so Joab thinks when Uriah's killed, well, David's probably going to grieve over this. And so he starts preparing him through a messenger. The messenger says, or he says to the messenger, the king may ask, why did you get so close to the city? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal? Didn't a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thebez? Why did you get so close to the wall? If he asks you this, then say to him, also your servant Uriah is dead. The messenger set out, and when he arrived, he told David everything Joab had said to him. The messenger said to David, the men overpowered us. They came against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance of the city gate. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah is dead. He's waiting for the outburst. He's waiting for the, I can't believe this happened. That's my friend. He's waiting for that. And here's David's response. David told the messenger, say to Joab, don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as the other. I don't know if you've noticed, but what just happened here is that because David was allowing intelligence to sit above God in the throne of his heart, it changed his character. Where previously he grieved over the death of even his enemies, this time when his friend dies, he looks up and he says, no big deal. Everybody dies at some point. You know, the sword kills one today, it'll kill another tomorrow. It changed him. It altered his character. That's a scary thing, guys. It took a guy who was empathetic and compassionate and loving, and it made him callous and cold, hard, because he let rationalization take the driver's seat of his life. Finishing out this chapter, it says, when Uriah, in verse 25, it says, press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. So again, he puts his final plan in place. Okay, we'll just do this quickly. We'll get her in my house, and it'll just seem natural that she ends up having a baby. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. What does God want more than anything else in the world? What does God desire from us more than anything else? You know what I think it is? I think it's intimacy. We talked about that when we had communion just a minute ago. I think God desires intimacy with us more than anything else in the world. Do you know what separates intimacy? You know what drives a wedge between intimacy? It's misused intelligence. Misused rationalizations. That's what kills relationships. That's what kills intimacy. And that's why God says this is a big deal. Don't let intelligence and rationalization sit on the throne of your heart. When your thoughts overrule God, it doesn't only hurt you, your entire team pays the price. So what's the answer? How do we deal with this? How do we get past the point where we're allowing rationalization to drive us? If you paid attention, we didn't get a good answer in chapter 11. I mean, it kind of just told us the story, right? And so really the answer comes in chapter 12. So if you haven't read chapter 12, I'm about to have a spoiler moment here, so just hang in here with me, all right? Chapter 12, this is what happens. A prophet comes to David and says, you have blown it, you messed up. God said that you should not have done this. And David finally comes to the point where he says, you're right. He finally stops rationalizing. He finally stops covering it up. He finally stops making excuses. And he just says, I have blown it. I should have been listening to God, but I was trying to make it work the way that I wanted. And so the first thing that he does is he confesses to God. He says, God, I have sinned against you. I have messed up. And that's the first step to getting beyond this, guys. That's the first step to taking rationalization off the throne, is that we go to God and we say, I have messed up. I have created a mess. I have created a problem. And I don't want to walk in this anymore. That's where David starts. But here's the cool thing. Right after that, almost immediately after that in chapter 12, you know what happens? Joab, the commander of the army, sends word back to David, and he says, we are taking the city right now. He says, if you don't re-engage in the battle, I'm going to get the credit for this. So after David confesses, the very next thing that he does is he drops everything and he runs to re-engage in the battle. Guys, maybe that's where you are this morning. Maybe you've been just sitting back saying, oh, everything's going to be fine. Maybe you've been rationalizing, saying, you know what? The church can handle that stuff. I don't have to worry about that. I can sit back and take it easy. You know what God is saying to you? You need to re-engage in the battle. The war isn't over yet. Your family, it seemed like they were fine, and now they're struggling because you sat back saying you need to re-engage in the battle for your family. Your spiritual health, you've been, hit and miss, and you connect with God sometimes, and sometimes you go a week or 2 weeks and you don't even think about God. He says you need to re-engage in the battle. Go to God and tell Him, I have tried to rationalize my way through life, and I've made a mess. And not only do I confess that to you, but now I want to re-engage. Now I want to re-enter what I know you told me to do a while ago. Guys, there comes a point where we have to be strong, where we have to stop rationalizing, and where we have to stop injuring our team, where we have to stop causing our team to pay the price. God says to do that, confess and re-engage in the battle. Don't just keep going down the same path. Don't just keep, saying, oh, it's going to go away. It's not that big a deal. Confess and re-engage in the battle. That's where it all changes. That's where God takes over the throne again. And we are led by Him rather than by our latest thoughts. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much that you don't disengage from us. Thank you so much that you don't walk away from us, that you don't turn your back on us. Even as we tend to turn our backs on you, you just patiently pursue us. God, I pray that we would have the humility of David to say, I've messed up, I've created a mess, and I want to make it right. I want to re-engage in the battle. Father, we're thankful that David's legacy is not built on this story, but you would go on to call him a man after your own heart. I thank you that our story is not over either. Help us to re-engage in the way that you want us to. We love you so much. We pray these things in the power of your